Minimum wage. Why are we talking about it? It's in the news right now. Seattle's testing out a $15 minimum wage. Ontario is about to do the same. So is BC. So what is a minimum wage and why do we have it? Strictly speaking, minimum wage is the price floor below which workers may not sell their labor time. Its negative purpose is to minimize exploitation of workers, while its positive purpose is to guarantee a living wage tied to the price of food and rent adequate enough to ensure capable members of both a standing army and a working class. Capitalism also requires a constant flow of money. If a large portion of the population can't afford to engage in consumer spending, the money stops moving and the system fails. The fundamental law of capitalism is that if workers don't have money, businesses don't have customers. Setting a reasonable minimum wage helps ensure consumer spending can continue by ever so slightly mitigating the effects of the naturally expanding wealth gap. So why not raise the minimum wage? Well, first off, employers get all pissy because they claim their profits will suffer. Some will cut jobs, some will even discover they can no longer afford to do business. Oh, the horror! Here's the thing. Anytime there's an adjustment in the economy, some will fail and some will win. Those capitalists whose businesses depend entirely on paying workers as little as legally possible will have to either find a way to innovate or fail. Boo-hoo. If your business is so fragile that it can only exist in a world where you're allowed to pay starvation wages, then what good is your business? Thankfully, we have Karl Marx to help explain this to us in simple terms. Whether a business can cope with a wage hike all depends on what they're selling. Some capitalists make necessaries. Some capitalists make luxuries. If you raise wages, you favor spending on the former over the latter. That's because a raise for low-wage workers increases demand for those necessaries. If that marginally lowers the income of capitalists as a class, then demand for luxuries sold to the affluent would also fall. And we see this today. There was no demand for all the yachts and condos and million-dollar sports cars 30 years ago. That's because wealth inequality was not that high like it is now. Thanks, Ronald Reagan. Marx explains that at the outset, because of higher demand, necessaries would perhaps cost a little more for a while, but only until the low-cost producers expanded production, and the most ambitious among them would come up with new technologies and new machineries to lower their costs, at which point prices would fall back down. So yacht makers and Rolex watch makers and Bugatti makers would particularly suffer in the shift in demand caused by rising wages. Kind of like we see today, when the rich are very rich, an immense proportion of the national produce must be produced in the shape of luxuries. The opposite holds true when the poor and middle class hold a greater share of the wealth, like they did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you know, the golden era of capitalism, when it kinda worked. But that's enough from dead intellectuals. Why don't we ask some actual business owners how they feel about minimum wage? And I quote, "Had business executives now complaining about hikes to the minimum wage spoken out against harsh, one-sided regulations favoring commercial landlords over retail tenants, I might have been more amenable to paying attention to their arguments against raising the minimum wage now. But they have seldom, if ever, called for a reform of business regulations which often leave small businesses at the mercy of rapacious landlords who arbitrarily hike costs exponentially or refuse to renew leases on a whim. That, more often than not, was the straw that broke the back of many small business owners I knew when I was operating one."
We came in and the rent was, I think it was around $7,000, $7,500 when we took over. 4 years later, it's over $11,000 now.
Matt Vasile has owned and operated his restaurant, Lisa Marie, for 4 years. It's considered popular and successful, but he also has a number of other business interests, including food trucks and catering, that he runs out of the Queen West location. He says that is key to staying afloat.
I'll be honest, if we were just a restaurant, we would not be able to afford to stay here. Yeah. And that is, that's the truth. As much as I hate to admit it, that is, with the growing costs, it's just not feasible.
Matt says in 4 years, he has seen 32 restaurants open and close along the strip of Queen between Bathurst and Ossington. It's thanks to gentrification, and that has driven rent prices for restaurants in that area up to $80 to $90 a square foot. Prices primarily only formula retail or chains can afford.
Landlords are the enemy, not workers. Next is my favorite and stupidest argument. Inflation will rise. Oh, you mean kind of like it always does anyway, no matter what? Regardless? Funny how when you look at a graph of inflation and you look at the plot points of where minimum wage has been raised, nothing happens. Yes, but won't higher wages encourage companies to increase mechanization and fire more workers? Increasingly, companies are seeking to replace workers with robots. Will a minimum wage hike change that in any way? No. Capitalists have been replacing workers with machines since the industrial age. They're gonna do it regardless. And why wouldn't they? Machines don't get sick. They don't steal. They don't go on smoke breaks. So the question you need to be asking isn't, are we going to scare companies into making more robots? You need to be asking, shouldn't we as a society be benefiting from technology and mechanization? And if we're not, then what the hell kind of system are we in where we're not benefiting from it? In a system that made any sense at all, technology and robots should free up labor, not compete with it and lower its value. Okay, so what are the benefits to raising minimum wage? Well, the one thing we know about the poor is they spend all their money. Have you ever had to live on minimum wage or even near minimum wage to support your family or just yourself? You literally have nothing left after you pay bills and rent. Even food isn't a guarantee. Need a chef's knife to chop what little food you have? Tough patooties. Probiotics for your GI problems? Beat it, hobo. Massage therapist, chiropractor, dentist, orthotist, eye care specialist. Suck it up, buttercup. Want a gym membership? Take a hike, loser. Think 2 low-wage jobs will solve the problem? Still wrong. The more astute among you might ask, what's the point of asking everyone in society to work if that work doesn't allow them to survive, let alone thrive? When the poor and middle class have money to spend, that creates demand. So much demand, in fact, that small businesses whose labor costs have just gone up are now making more profits than they were before. As any economist worth his salt will tell you, as minimum wage goes up, jobs always go up and industries do better.
The country has raised the minimum wage 22 times. You know, given this theory that if wages rise, employment should shrink, we should have zero employment, right? What you can actually do is you can go back to those 22 times and look at the increase and then figure out what happened to jobs. So here's the crazy thing. That of the 22 times, unless the country was in recession, jobs went up. Every single time. What surprised even us from the data is that the more affected the industry was by the wage increase. In other words, hospitality workers are massively affected by a minimum wage increase, but doctors and lawyers aren't. Right?
That's right. That makes sense.
Right?
Yep.
So you would expect, given the orthodoxy, that hospitality employment would go down, would be more negatively affected by the minimum wage. It turns out to be the opposite. Is that the more affected by the increase, the better the industry did. Why? Because that's how capitalism works. Because when workers have more money, businesses have more customers and hire more workers.
And here's the kicker. As the man himself, Karl Marx, so eloquently pointed out in his pamphlet Value, Price, and Profit, even after wages are hiked, because capitalists are still forced to compete with each other, prices don't actually go up beyond what inflation would otherwise bring. Because, by the system's own logic, customers will still hunt for the lowest price. The neoliberal era of capitalism, through which we are currently suffering, is designed to be very efficient at accumulating and concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer hands, while leaving less and less for workers and the public sphere. Now, your average idiot might say, so what's wrong with that? They deserve it if they worked hard and earned it. Cool story, bro. The problem is that system breaks the economy. When a rich person's annual income equal about 1,000 times the annual median wage, they don't consume 1,000 times more pillows than the average American. Even the richest among us only needs 1 or 2. And that's the problem with capitalists. They are by nature hoarders of wealth. The more they hoover up from the public sphere and the rest of us, the less there is to keep the actual economy afloat.
And it makes good business sense because we know right now that after, Flaherty's, under the Stephen Harper's, all their tax cuts did sweet diddly to stimulate the economy. All that it did is create literally billions of dollars in what they call dead money that is not being invested anywhere. And so basically all that money just gets stockpiled. It doesn't do any good. So we're saying, here's the way to put that money into action. Pay your workers properly. They can shop at local stores. Low-income workers tend to spend most of their money because there's not a lot of wiggle room for saving. They don't invest in offshore accounts. They generally don't have enough money to go to Bora Bora for their vacations. So that's why it tends to actually help.
So when you propose something like raising the minimum wage from $11 to $15, what happens to the people who are already making $13, $14, $15, $16 right now? Well, the spillover effect sees people's wages at near the minimum wage go up as the minimum wage rises. So your painters and your roofers are going to get bumped up to $17, $18, $19 an hour instead of sticking to $15.
Or people who spent 15 years to just so that they could not see themselves as non-minimum wage earners, and now they feel like, oh man, so guess what, I'm a minimum wage earner again. It's like I've climbed my way to 15 bucks an hour, and now everyone's going to get 15, and what am I, chopped liver? And those are real feelings, and they're not, it's what 40 years of neoliberalism has done to our collective psyche.
The other cool benefit is tax receipts to the government go up. Income taxes and especially sales taxes get a big boost, which means more money for services. In 2014 in the US, the Congressional Budget Office released a report on a minimum wage. They concluded that an increase to only $10.10 would kill 500,000 jobs but create 900,000 jobs. When New Jersey raised minimum wage 18% and neighboring Pennsylvania did not, Alan Kruger and David Card decided to study the effects. What did they find? Restaurant employment actually increased in New Jersey, despite the prevailing wisdom. What's this I hear? Sounds like faint conservative rabbling about the University of Washington study on Seattle's $15 minimum wage. Forget that 20 years of study shows that a higher minimum wage actually helped the economy. Never mind the Berkeley study that came out a couple weeks before. When one study came out showing slightly negative effects to the Seattle economy, conservatives had a fit in the news and on social media. Obviously none of them actually read the study, because if they did, they would have known that fully 40% of minimum wage workers were excluded from the study because they were employed by big corporations. So I guess the lesson is, if you exclude half of what you're supposed to be studying, then you can come up with whatever results you want. If you're conservative, this next one should really wet your noodle. A living wage means more people get off the welfare.
The welfare queen is pulling something out of her costume. What is that? It's food stamps!
Get so much money from the government, I just throw it away!
Hey, come on now, good people.
Oh my goodness, she is literally shoving her socialist welfare policy down my throat!
Part of the disincentive inherent in EI, Ontario Works, ODSP, is that in most circumstances, you actually get less money for working than you do for staying on the programs. Plus, you lose your health benefits. Most of these people want to work, but the majority of jobs out there pay so little that it would be irrational for people to take them.
Frankly, employers have been getting workers on the cheap, man. It's like they don't even have to pay subsistence because we have social programs that actually scoop it up. You know, in the days of Adam Smith didn't think that wages would ever fall below subsistence because there was no social safety net at that time. But we have a social safety net, and so because of that, employers are subsidized for cheap labor for poverty level wages all the time. So we have to say no, employers have to pay their fair share.
Raising the minimum wage to $15 changes all that, and means we spend much less money on social programs. So if you don't want people living off your tax dollars, then how about allowing them to live off their wages for a change? By the way, there is no legislated minimum wage in countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland, Switzerland, Denmark, Iceland, and Italy. Why? Because union collective bargaining covers all workers in those countries. And minimum pay in these agreements comes to about 60 to 70% of the average wage, unlike in Canada and the US, where minimum wage is 50% or lower of the average wage. Still think $15 is too rich? The negotiated minimum in Denmark is the equivalent of $22.50 Canadian dollars. The legislated minimum in Australia is $17.70, and yet the sky hasn't fallen.
You are fake news.
Sir,
Go ahead.
We all know what's really going on with this debate. Employers don't want to pay higher wages, and workers want to get them. That's the way the system works. Of course, one of the main problems of capitalism is that employers cannot fathom the concept of less profits for the greater good. In fact, it's impossible for them to think this way even if they wanted to, because they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders above all else. Capitalism demands that a business must profit more this year than it did last year. It requires exponential growth, which is absurd. We don't live on an exponential planet. We live on a finite planet with finite resources and finite places to invest capital. They even have very special words they came up with for any state other than exponential growth: recession and depression. Capitalism is a system that implodes the minute it stops growing. It's the kind of system you'd invent for some video game like Civilization. Enacting it on Earth is like trying to jam a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't fit. Let's find one that does. Alright, so what's a better solution to all this? Just do what the US government did in the 1930s when they first introduced the minimum wage. Have a government jobs program to get people to work. This also forces private companies to offer better wages in order to compete with the government. You can also impose a pay ratio, like they tried to do in Switzerland, meaning no executive can earn more than 12 times the amount of the company's lowest earning employees. While these ideas are great, to get at the real meat of the issue, what you really need is a universal basic income or basic income guarantee. A basic income guarantee is an extremely simple system. It works by paying every single person in society the exact same amount, enough to ensure everyone has their basic needs taken care of. Expensive? Yes. But also, not really. Because you can easily claw back the payments with an equivalent income tax on the middle class and rich. This ends up working pretty much the same as Milton Friedman's negative income guarantee, but with even less bureaucracy. The advantage of both of these systems is that they require far less administration and overhead costs than current entitlement schemes. And they are not paternalistic, like the current nanny state welfare system we have now. Now, if you're worried this sounds too socialist for you, keep in mind that Milton Friedman is the 20th century's most popular and most influential right-wing economist, and he thinks this is a good idea.
The proposal for a negative income tax is a proposal to help poor people by giving them money, which is what they need, rather than as now, by requiring them to come before a governmental official, detail all their assets and their liabilities, and be told that you may spend X dollars on rent, Y dollars on food, etc., and then be given a handout. The idea of the negative income tax is to treat people who are poor in the same way as we treat people who are rich. Both groups would have to file income tax returns, and both groups would be treated in parallel way.
What are you going to do with a poor person who, having consumed his $3,000, spends all of that on the races?
There undoubtedly would still be some people who would dissipate it on booze or on the races. There are now. Is there any doubt whatsoever that people on relief are able to find ways of getting around?
I know you may not be aware that I don't know how it works in Chicago, but for instance in New York, there are direct payments by some of the welfare agencies to houses, to landlords, and that kind of business, and occasionally it goes so far at the discretion of the caseworker, direct payments to grocers, so that X amount of shredded wheat instead of X amount of pot is delivered.
I understand, but you and I understand the free market, and that shredded wheat, once delivered, doesn't have to stay in the home to which it's delivered. Let's not underestimate the ingenuity of the poor people in converting.
That's right.
In converting what they get from the relief worker to what they want.
That's true, but I think
and that's just wasteful.
Yeah.
They would be far better off if we just gave them the money and let them spend it, because a welfare worker is not in a position to help the relief recipient.
Well,
he is a policeman and a spy. He has to keep tabs on him to be sure he gets the money.
Therefore, the kind of spying that goes with caseworking is an act really of patronage, isn't it?
You have a system which stimulates abuse.
Aren't you evading the point?
Let me go back to your
abuse. Absent the abuses, you've still got a situation in which somebody has got to concern himself over the administration of the family by somebody who's a member of the disorganized poor.
For a great large fraction of the people who are being helped, they have every incentive to do it themselves. If we give them the money, we will strengthen their responsibility. The number of people on the welfare rolls has been skyrocketing. Why? Because once they get on, we make it almost impossible for them to get off. In order for somebody who gets on to get off, he or she has to be able to have a really good job, because to earn a little bit, get off gradually, now doesn't pay. Under a negative income tax, you would have give the poor people a possibility of getting off gradually. They can earn an extra $100 or an extra $200 and be better off.